New Delhi once again of fresh economic heat if peace talks with Moscow fail. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says that secondary tariffs on India could rise further if President Donald Trump's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska this Friday does not yield results. Now, Bessent reminded that Washington had already imposed a 25% tariff on Indian goods and doubled it to 50% last week over India's purchase of Russian oil, accusing New Delhi of fueling the war machine. Now, and Trump himself has warned Russia of very severe consequences if the Ukraine war does not end after the Alaska talks. Now, Bessent also urged European allies to join in secondary sanctions to build more pressure on Moscow. The warning comes after Prime Minister Modi assured Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that Indian side remains committed to an early peaceful resolution of the conflict. Prime Minister Modi has also hit back at Trump's tariff hikes, saying India will not compromise the interests of its farmers. The MEA has called the US's move unfair, unjustified and unreasonable in the past, pointing out that India's imports are guided by market factors and the need to secure energy for 1.4 billion people.
First of all, I'm a believer that India should not compromise on its energy security or its strategic autonomy. We are here for a long-term game and we must win the long-term war. My belief is that we built up a relationship with the United States over 2.5 decades, which was bipartisan in nature. And this attempt to put a 50% duty does not stand to logic. But in many other areas, if you look at electronic goods or pharma sector or services sector, these sectors are not getting impacted. And therefore, it will have only a very, very minor marginal impact on Indian economy.
All right, that's Amitabh Kant, Niti Aayog CEO, saying that even if the 50% tariff were to go through, it will have very little impact on India's export sector. But there is now a fresh warning from the US. And how does one read it? Let's talk about that. Joining us on the show is Pathikrit Pine, Senior Research Fellow, Syama Prasad Mukherjee Research Foundation. Thank you very much, Mr. Pine, for taking time out for joining us on the show. Let me first begin by asking, what is the nature of today's threat? This comes on the back of a 50% tariff levy, of 25% plus 25% as penalty for continuing to import Russian oil. Now, warning India of more duties, more penalties, how does it even make any sense?
Good evening, and it shows how irrational some people can be, because the threats of more sanctions are as if India is responsible for the conflicts. It's as if Russia was told by India to have this conflict with Ukraine. And I am, there is no limit to this bizarre approach of the United States. But at the same time, it is pretty clear that even when these sanctions are, multiplied by more tariff rather than sanctions, I apologize, it would have limited impact, because at most only $40 billion of India's exports are getting impacted, which as percentage of India's overall export is only, it's something like 5%. And as percentage of India's GDP stands to something around 1% of the GDP. So overall impact, because electronics, pharma and services are exempted from it, overall impact is probably barely 1% of the GDP, which we can absorb. But I don't understand the irrationality of this approach. And as has been stated by Ministry of External Affairs, that this is unreasonable, unjustified and unfair. This is not a conflict which India has anything to do with. It has a lot to do with the expansionist agenda of NATO. It has a lot to do with Trump, unfortunately, not being successful in the last 2-3 months in stopping this conflict, in spite of the tall claims made by him that he would be able to finish this conflict, stop it within a day after he joins the government. So blaming India is almost
would it be fair to say that it appears like Washington is punishing India for its own failure to get Ukraine and Russia on a table and find a way to end the war? So they are basically punishing India for their own failure.
Well, yes, you are absolutely right, because it doesn't seem that even tomorrow, when the meeting actually happens between President Putin and President Trump, it doesn't seem that President Putin will be interested in the offer being given to him, because all that Russia would say is pretty clear, that the land on which Russia has its own dominance in the eastern part of Ukraine, they would not give it over. And I think today, United States, in spite of all the tall claims being made by President Trump, is in a position to give too much of threats to Russia, because there's hardly any trade between Russia and United States. Yeah, and Russia, United States is not even in a position to wage a war on Russia. So it's almost as if they have given up on the hope that there will be any kind of reconciliation or resolution of the issue tomorrow. And that is why they are looking for a scapegoat. That is why they're as if trying to put pressure on India to tell Russia to mend the ways and accept. That is not the way it happens. Russia has to look after its own interest, as United States does the same, and we will have to keep our own interest in mind. These kind of threats are not going to improve the relationship between India and United
Not.
States.
In
We
fact,
are a strategic
would it
partner
be
of.
fair to say that India and US relationship are the worst they've been in 2.5 decades? That at least is what Amitabh Kant also said just a couple of minutes ago in the reaction that we heard. But let me bring you back on to tariffs. Now, the tariff, the exposure that India has to US tariffs is to the tune of $80 billion in Indian exports to the United States market. And if these were to be impacted directly by a 50% tariff, we are looking at an estimated 1% GDP reduction for India. How significant is it if we are not to arrive at any trade deal with the US come 25th of August, when the US negotiators will be in India? That's number one. Number two, today's threat, a fresh threat, could also likely mean that more exports could be targeted if the levy of 50% were to go higher.
Well, they would, in case they increase the tariffs, they would only be increasing the tariff on the existing products on which they have already imposed the tariffs. Now that sums up to around $40 billion, because the rest of the $40 billion includes software services, electronics, on pharma, which are already exempted, and they will not impose tariffs on that, because it would have a severe impact on the Americans themselves. So on the $40 billion which is impacted, Trump presumes that more tariff will impact it more. Well, we are in a position to absorb that 1%. It is not to say that it would have no impact, but I think this is a manageable impact. And I think it also gives India the opportunity to re-evaluate the situation and diversify the market, which the Indian government has already started. There is a massive amount of effort which is being put for contingency measures to secure the exporters who might be impacted, and secondly, to diversify the market further into other countries, so that the dependence on United States as a market reduces considerably. And as it is, if you look at the activist policy of Prime Minister Modi, as you look at it from the perspective of the impetus that he has given on Global South as part of the Voice of Global South Forum or Global South Summit, it is pretty clear that India, beyond a point, will not be impacted, because, first of all, we are not an export-oriented economy. More than 80% of India's GDP comes from the internal economy. And secondly, we have diversified considerably as our export metrics. So the impact, even though it is there, it would be very limited. And I don't think these threats are going to impact, or we are not going to succumb on the pressure and open up our dairy market or the fisheries market or poultry market.
Which
If
I
that
think,
is exactly what the Trump administration is looking
right.
for.
So let's put that in perspective. The reason why you're mentioning farming and dairy market is because of the understanding, which has now been made very clear by Prime Minister himself, that the only reason we've not been able to arrive at an interim deal with the US is because India is not ready to open its farming sector and its dairy sector. We do not want genetically modified corn and soya bean, and for that market to come into India and affect Indian farmers.
Absolutely right. First and foremost, it would impact 12 to 15 crore farmers. I mean, the poultry, the dairy, the fisheries, and the core agriculture sector. Secondly, the issue of genetically modified crops and its impact on the health has tremendous consequences. So invariably, we do not want to increase the health hazards. Third, the dairy market, the dairy organizations, manufacturing companies, first of all, in United States are mostly the agriculture sector is heavily subsidized. So when the subsidized agriculture produce of America are put into the Indian market, it will severely impact our own producers and the farmers, and they will be out of their service job or livelihood. And eventually we would have a food dependence on the Americans, which we don't want. And secondly, if you look at the dairy market, they provide or they feed non-veg food to their cattle. That has a severe, health consequences. There is something called the mad cow disease, which is already documented in the Western countries for taking dairy products from cows which have been fed non-veg food items. Now, we do not want that in India. In India, the milk or milk products like paneer are considered sattvic products and that are used as offering during puja. How can we allow American companies using non-veg food being fed to the cattle for something as essential as milk? So I think there are reasons, and any kind of trade deal depends on mutual win-win situation. I mean, this is not a win-win situation for India. All these pressure tactics are not going to work. Eventually, when you look at the livelihood of 12 to 15 crore farmers, for a democracy like India, number one, no political party can risk it. And number two, it is not needed. We are self-sufficient in dairy, poultry, farming,
Our
fisheries,
political
and
currency,
agriculture. Why should we open
100%.
it up?
I mean, farmers are our political currency, so that's number one. Number two, let's not forget that farmers in the US are heavily subsidized. Their cost of produce is very low, which essentially means if they flood Indian markets, it's going to have severe impact on Indian farmers. And India is not ready to do that. We are not ready to compromise on farmers' interests. So it's about India's food security, it's about our energy security and an independent foreign policy. That's the struggle therein. But stay with us, Pratikrit, because more news is coming in. Now, ahead of his US visit, Russian President Vladimir Putin has huddled up with his top delegation to plan strategy for his Alaska summit with Donald Trump. Putin praised the US administration, saying it is making sincere efforts to end Ukraine conflict. He said Washington wants good relations between Russia and the US and Europe and peace in the world. Putin also suggested that Moscow and Washington could strike a deal on nuclear arms control, calling it the next goal in strengthening global stability. The Russian leader made these remarks just before leaving for the US, where high-stakes talk and with Trump, in fact, are set up for Friday. So it's a crucial day tomorrow, Pratikrit, where perhaps there'll be more clarity on whether the long-standing 3-year-old Russia-Ukraine war will finally end or not. But initial statements coming in there from Putin hinting that perhaps he is looking to negotiate with the US.
Well, absolutely. But we also have to understand the issue that the conflict has a lot to do with NATO, about which our External Affairs Minister, Mr. S. Jaishankar, has also mentioned several times. You know, this is not a war between Russia versus Ukraine. This is a war that has been going on between Russia versus NATO. There are 30-odd countries giving weapon systems to Ukraine to fight the war. So first thing that Russia has been saying is this: the expansion of NATO must stop. And number two, rearming of Ukraine must stop. If those conditions are not met, and I don't think in that case Russia will be willing to give up on the hard-earned benefits or the advantage that they have got in the last 3 years. And we also have to understand this war didn't start in 2022. It started in 2014 with a regime change that happened in Ukraine, done by the Western powers and led by John McCain and Victoria Nuland of the United States. So regime change, anarchy, civil unrest, and eventually triggering conflict is something the world has seen several times, orchestrated by the West. In this case, I think the Russians are pretty clear. Unless their conditions are met, they're not going to give it up. Well, we all hope for the war to end, but I don't think the war will end on by threatening Russia or by threatening India as if India is responsible for that conflict. It has to be a win-win situation on both sides. Well, that is something that the West must understand, that somewhere there is a Western hegemony that is responsible for this conflict. That conflict can be ended if the expansionist approach of NATO ends. Back to you.